Hello, everybody, and welcome to Richard and Karl present Deep Space and Dragons, where we attempt to casually gaslight you into thinking this was always the show name. I'm your host, Richard,
And I'm your host, Carl.
and welcome to our show. So, to start things off, what's new with you?
I recently bought a brand new phone, the TCL 20 Pro, and I was just surprised to discover not only does it have a headphone jack, which is becoming increasingly rare, but it also has a IR TV remote functionality.
Wait, that's. Okay, so full disclosure, the remote for my TV has been slowly decaying over 5 years. And
Yeah.
so, for whatever reason, and it might not just be me, and if any of our viewers want to comment later if this happens to them, I keep trying to push the button like harder with more like effort in the hopes that it will somehow make it work. And you're just handed the solution to my problems. So, does it actually work pretty well?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. Like, IR technology doesn't really seem to have changed over like the past 15 years because I have that 15-year-old TV that you traded to me when it was too big for you to move because it weighs 80 pounds.
Oh, there's some nostalgia there.
And I just turned turned on my phone to the function, and there we go. Now it works for that TV. So.
Tragically, I cannot update my phone. It'll be a while before I can justify a new one. But that so cleanly would solve my problem. Uh, it is deeply tragic.
What's new with you?
Let's see. As my brain freezes for a moment. Well, I've spent more time into Mario Maker, and I made a stage so difficult last night that it took me 3 hours to beat my own creation, and now my thumb is slightly sore.
So difficult. It took you 3 hours to beat your own creation.
Well, what I tried doing is I tried remaking an indie game called Jump King, which is literally jump to the top of a tower.
Okay,
And
okay.
I ended up using the vertical map in Mario Maker, and then taking advantage of like sectioning it so I could make it 2 towers out of it.
Yeah, the vertical map in Mario Maker is definitely one of the coolest new features they added to Mario Maker 2.
Oh yeah, so I made this thing, but I specifically made it like super precision pixel jumps, and there's no enemies to kill you, just the timer as you climb through my needlessly elaborate. Like in my efforts to create this, I just created some extremely mean jumping puzzles. And
Okay.
and it's lined up that if you biff a jump, you will plummet almost all the way to the bottom of the stage.
Do you have any halfway points?
No, because then I'd have to beat the section twice.
Well, I mean, yeah, I was just wondering if by beating it you meant it was upload ready or.
Oh, I did successfully upload it, so you should definitely give it a try after this meeting.
For sure.
And as for projects together we've been working on, we've started adapting the Dungeons and Dragons module Candle Keep to be a single going campaign. Thoughts on that one?
Yeah. I mean, there's a little bit of extra fluff that we have to add in to get it all the way from where it is to be 1 to 20 episode adventure. But so far, we've broken it down into a couple of seasons, each 5 adventures long, which we're hoping to adapt into single session adventures so that each season will only take just a little bit more than a month or so.
Yeah,
So it'll actually feel like it's completable.
Yeah, one thing both me and my co-host has discovered over a course of running tabletop RPGs is I'm not entirely sure anyone in human history has made it from level 1 to level 20 in 5th edition's Dungeons and Dragons. So we're trying to run things at like a more humanly feasible leveling curve.
Yeah. Like if you use the experience system, it's a bit. Some levels are cost more experience than later levels, and it's just kind of a bizarre mess. And then also the amount of encounters you need to actually gain a level. Just as a personal thing, I would recommend against using experience to actually level your players because that will be a slow and painful grind.
Yeah, in my personal experience, I agree. I definitely hit a point pretty early on where I started awarding levels when it felt right, rather than, or when the pre-established adventure suggested it, rather than trying to track each number. Because, to be perfectly candid, my D&D players, I love my D&D players. I don't expect anyone to even accurately track rations or arrows, let alone experience points. Because,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. For new DMs in general, it's important to note that when you watch professional Dungeons and Dragons, those players and DMs have a financial interest in presenting the best product possible. So the players are going to be way more polite and cooperative than the average player that you'll DM in a casual game.
and not just that, but they have the time and effort to literally have people help with the tracking. But to go into our topic today, so eloquently transitioned, we're going into tabletop RPGs. So there's been a number of announcements of games coming out of different game engines and themes and settings and worlds. And I want to bring up with my co-host here the idea of, should large companies be allowed to kickstart an RPG?
Well, I mean, that's kind of an interesting question because I mean anybody should be allowed to get funding for whatever passion project they might want. It does seem a little bit odd that a major company wouldn't be able to get the funding from themselves, but at the same time, investors are fickle people, so maybe they don't approve of the project, and you have to try and find the funding from elsewhere.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the big ones that came out over the last month was an Avatar: The Last Airbender tabletop RPG, which I think the Kickstarter kicked in at around... It was in the millions for sure. And the studio that did it, Magpie Games, I don't actually know whether or not the studio really needed it, but yeah, it hit over $11 million Canadian.
Wow, that's an impressive mark to make. I will say, in kickstarting pretty much anything, there's a lot of risks, because if they way overshoot their projected targets, then you might run into legal issues where the money doesn't get appropriated properly. But that aside, Kickstarter is a great way to get passion projects that otherwise can't get funding because people don't believe in your vision.
But to go into the specifics of this Avatar game, just to kind of pivot gears a bit from the finance and more into the game itself. So, tabletop RPGs typically fall into, I'm going to say 4 categories arbitrarily. I may not hit 4 categories. Feel free to call me out on that. The first are the roleplay focused ones, where the rules in the game are as loose as possible, because the game is about collaborative storytelling. It's not how much damage and how far can I shoot a fire blast. It's, I gather my chi and shoot out a lame of fire to create a burning wall. And it's more about the flair rather than the actual mechanics.
Yeah, Avatar: The Last Airbender that just came out here for the tabletop RPG is definitely one of those types of games where it's actually in the rules that you are required to describe whatever attack you're doing, and essentially it functions entirely on the rule of cool, so long as your vision for the story lines up reasonably well with your DM's vision of the story.
Yeah, one thing I found particularly fascinating, and for just to get everybody up to speed if somehow you've lived under a rock and have no idea what Avatar: The Last Airbender is, it is a fantastic live-action movie. Nah, I can't even pretend that. So, Avatar: The Last Airbender was a Nickelodeon animated series that, instead of trying to do their more classic gag of the week episode, attempting to tell a single ongoing serialized story. And a lot of people like to claim that it elevated Western animation and effectively broke down the idea that instead of people not having the attention span to watch these cartoons with their kids, you could go all out and tell a complete, well-rounded story with full character arcs in the medium. In in my opinion, it was them borrowing ideas from Japanese animation's long-running serials and applying it to the more goofy, carefree nature of Western cartoons.
Yeah, it definitely had a lot of the charm of Western animation, but then also a lot of the writing and storytelling aspects of uh, anime, as people generally call it, Eastern animation, I suppose, uh, and definitely uh, told a very cohesive and intriguing story.
Agreed. Like, what's interesting is back when I was following a lot of anime in my anime, if I say it in the weirdest way possible, Avatar's announcements were being put on those websites. It was almost being treated like an anime release because the fan base overlaps so much. You just kind of
Mm-hmm.
see it snuck in there with the same announcements and news. Which was probably the first time in my life I've seen Western animation treated in that way.
And the writing for Avatar: The Last Airbender was actually pretty good too, um, as compared to some other Western writing, whereby the characters might have character development one week, and then the next week they had completely forgotten their character development, as it you know suddenly their development isn't important to the plot anymore, or it's important that they didn't develop, which ends up with characters that don't feel genuine because their improvement goes up and down so wildly. Avatar managed to have a nice steady curve towards an epic finale where all the characters actually feel like they grew as individuals as their skills grew.
Exactly. But one thing that makes it interesting for the way the tabletop RPG went is one of the core premise of Avatar is the majority of the cast have the ability to manipulate one of the four Greek classical elements: fire, water, earth, air. And a lot of their skills and abilities came with shooting fire, using air to fly or run super fast, or using the ability to sense earth to also work as the ability to read people's pulses. Makes sense if you try not to think about it too hard. But the tabletop RPG, you pick one, but it's just flavor. There's some special abilities you can get that apply to it later, but in the free test demo I did for the Avatar RPG, there is no actual gameplay difference between shooting fire and jumping through the air. And part of that might have been why I wasn't able to get my own group of D&D players to give it a shot.
Uh, yeah, I mean, one of the difficult things about tabletop RPGs in general is making sure that characters uh, feel unique while still, not feeling like any one character has any type of advantage, uh, and the lack of physical differences can sometimes lead people to feel like it's a bit stale, which is probably part of the reason that it relies so heavily on describing what you do, because then the players bring the uniqueness rather than the player classes.
But to pivot in the other direction away from this collaborative storytelling RPG, we're going to go into a couple new D&D related releases. So recently I did a Kickstarter for the Stargate 5th edition tabletop RPG. And it suffers from almost the reverse problem of they took the already complicated Dungeons and Dragons and added more mechanics and more systems to a game that we already have had single fights last entire hours, and you can play a single battle that can take, I don't know, I think my record for longest battle I've had was 5 hours of real time, which ironically took less than 5 minutes of game time.
Yeah, the timing system in D&D doesn't really translate that well to when you compare it to the real world. Uh, but I will say the Stargate RPG definitely has some cool ideas, and it definitely seems like it simplifies things for the earlier levels. But it gets far more complicated after level 5. which because at that point you basically begin building your own custom class, and so even even characters with the same first 5 base levels can end up with wildly different and unique classes, which is very interesting for people who are mechanically minded, but can lead to some frustration when rules feel too rigid to allow for actual role playing.
But to spin this into the positive, I love their class system. So D&D currently has 12 to 13 classes depending on whether or not you decide to allow artificers at the table. And a lot of these classes have some redundancy. So you have your fighters, which is pretty self-explanatory, your rogues, which you got your fighters, your melee character, your rogue being sneaky and skilled. So far so good, easy to track. You got your barbarian, which is your fighter but angry. And then you start going into druids, clerics, sorcerers, warlocks, bards, and then you start realizing that a lot of these characters use the same stats, but function differently, and it becomes harder and harder for your players to fully grasp what the differences between these classes are. I could give a 20-minute lecture on the difference between a wizard and a sorcerer, but that's pretty intensive required reading. Where Stargate breaks it down to scout, fighter, scientist, diplomat, engineer, medic. Done. They took the 6 main styles and cut the roster size in half, which I think is really good when your character says on the tin what it does.
Yeah, I definitely agree. If you're starting from the very beginning, the smaller roster of potential character choices can alleviate a lot of the choice paralysis that comes from trying to create a new character, particularly as Wizards of the Coast seems to be amping up their release schedule for, well, everything.
Yeah, Wizards.
So there's more and more content being available, and it's definitely nice at the beginning to tone things down a little bit and get into the groove of a new game with a simple class system.
So when we're on the topic of systems, so the Avatar: The Last System Airbender game engine, because most of these RPGs will actually use an engine underneath it, and most of these engines are open source, which is one of the coolest things about tabletop RPGs, is a lot of the owners of the engine, the core rules that the game runs on, make those engines open source so players can create their own content for it. Avatar runs on something known as Powered by the Apocalypse, which, as I mentioned before, doesn't really track hit points or damage or movement speed and is a tool to help you narrate. D&D 5th edition is literally powered by D&D 5th edition, so the Stargate game can use those rules to build their game, but are still allowed to release it without getting angry cease and desist letters. Another engine I've seen pop around a lot is the Deadlands engine, which was designed to kind of be a middle ground. You have 3 hit points, you have a various of stats and skills, and the combat in that one's designed to be simpler than D&D, but give a little more story flexibility. But because it's designed to run so many games, it's hard for even me to take a stance and read the entire rulebook and explain to other players how to play it.
Yeah, I mean the growing popularity of Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, there are lots of more adventurous players and stuff who are willing to try out different systems, but a lot of the more casual players have a hard enough time learning one system, let alone switching between multiple systems. So it is a little bit tricky to find a group that's willing to actually put in the effort to learn multiple systems. But they definitely do all have their unique advantages and disadvantages. I'm pretty sure the 3 hit point engine you were just talking about, weren't you telling me about a game that was like fighter, wizard, rogue or something like that?
Oh yes, so it was an original creation. Yes, it was Warrior, Wizard, and Rogue it was called, and it was an indie RPG designed to be 3 pages long. And your stats were literally your class. And the idea was your player would have two pieces of paper in front of them and it would tell them literally everything they could do. And the idea was to make it as simplistic as possible, because at the end of the day, a lot of these RPGs require your animation. But from my own players' feedback, I find that weirdly restrictions breed creativity. For example, in D&D, if you're a wizard, you probably have the most options you can have. But you spend most of your time looking and reading your spells and figuring out what you can do. Where if you're a fighter, where your only real options are attack and hide, you become more creative and you start thinking things like, I'm going to jump off this bridge, rip the head off this fishbowl that's attached to a mech suit, and grab the goldfish out of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree that to some extent, I think I said this earlier in the podcast here, choice paralysis is a real problem, particularly as engines get more complex, because you have so many options that it's hard to figure out which one is actually the best option, as opposed to just picking one and diving in. Where when you have fewer options, such as one of the martial archetypes like the fighter, or in the example that Richard was just talking about was the Blood Hunter class. They don't have magic. It's really mostly just attack. But if you want to keep yourself engaged, you kind of have to create interesting ways to utilize your attack. So finding cover to hide behind and stuff, which can often inspire other players to be creative as well. But I feel like the simpler classes actually kind of end up being somewhat of the leaders of parties like this, because they remind the more complicated characters that to stay more grounded and search for different ways to be creative with what they're doing.
But interestingly enough, is you have to still restrict players, I find, because if you give somebody the option of you can do anything, it'll cause, much like that Avatar game, if I tell you, you control fire, what do you want to do? It'll give you that choice paralysis, even though your actual actions you can make are only really 4 or 5 choices, along the lines of like attack, search, defend, convince. But to pivot to something else interesting, so a new game engine called Essence 20 has been announced, and it's being used by several IPs such as Power Rangers, G.I. Joe, and Transformers to make interplayable RPGs. And I have no idea how this one works. I cannot get my hands on the original rulebook.
Well, I mean, like, it works by targeting nostalgia.
Well, yes, you are absolutely correct. Because quite frankly, one thing that comes up a lot and I discuss with my players is I'll get whipped up in a flight of fancy. Like I'll find a Dragon Ball Z conversion for D&D, or I'll be like, I can make a Legend of Zelda campaign. And I get wrapped up in the nostalgia, but my players won't often bite. It's like if your system is more open-ended and is setting neutral, they can implant their own ideas onto it. But if you try and effectively do fan fiction with a series, I have trouble getting players to take that journey with me. Like, I can't really seem to get people on board with, say, for example, doing a Stargate campaign with me. But if I literally just called it Space Western, the Space Western campaign, I would actually get more players on board by being less specific.
Yeah. Well, so I've played in a the not Eberron, but Tal'Dorei campaign, and me personally, I don't really know much about Critical Role.
You mean you don't have 10,000 hours to put towards binge watching a show?
Yeah. So it was like everything was new and exciting for me. But then there's a lot of callbacks and references that I missed and that other players were kind of looking for. But eventually, the story that we were trying to tell deviated so far from the source material that it was almost as if the source material didn't even matter.
Which is fascinating because, say for example, I went on a flight of fancy and bought an Avatar: The Last Airbender. Say I did the Kickstarter, got the Avatar: The Last Airbender campaign. I honestly think that because I'd then be trying to voice existing characters and put them in, that one of my players gave a speech about how it has such a special place in their nostalgia that they wouldn't enjoy the campaign. But if I were to do an original setting that was similar to it, I don't think I'd have the same pushback. Like, for example, I don't think I could get players on board to play a Power Rangers campaign. But if I pitched them as do you want to do a campaign where you're a teenage superhero as part of a color-coded team fighting aliens, they'd be like, yeah! But the moment you put the branding on something, you almost cheapen it a bit.
But on the other hand, as you were saying, this new engine is designed for crossplay between multiple franchises, like He-Man Masters of the Universe versus Transformers. Sounds like it'd be a hilarious matchup.
You know what's crazy about this is Transformers and G.I. Joe have had crossover comics. Like, some of these crossovers with these game engines have happened. And one of my favorite crossovers of all time is a Power Rangers episode where the Ninja Turtles rolled up. That is a thing that happened in our lifetimes, and I'm grateful for it. Because one thing I've noticed is we seem to be in the era of crossovers. Marvel's deep dived into it.
It's somewhat difficult to come up with new content that's actually going to grab viewers and continue to generate revenue. So, I mean, on the one hand, I wish studios would put more effort into creating brand new content. On the other hand, it's like we need content that's actually going to catch on, that people are going to recognize, and so it's like the era of crossovers is definitely here, because that is what grabs people's attention. And like I said, there's some very interesting ideas that could come about from this that would never have functioned in the past.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, let's give ourselves a nice little recap of today's chat. So, today we talked about cell phones activating as TV remotes. Talked about playing Mario Maker till my finger literally bled so I could upload a level to torture people. I have a Band-Aid on now, it's fine. We talked about Dungeons & Dragons, a little bit about converting the new Candlekeep story adventure of short stories into a playable campaign. We talked about the Avatar: The Last Airbender RPG, Dungeons & Dragons, Dungeons & Stargates, Deep Space and Dragons. We looked at the various game engines that are low interaction, high interaction. And if there's anything we missed in this discussion, feel free to post it in the comments. And let's wrap up today's session with the random question of the week. Well, I guess the unrelated random question, or the crazy random happenstance question of the week. So, this week's question is, and I'll ask it to Karl first and then answer myself, is Yoshi a dragon?
Well, I mean, I would tend to say yes, because, I mean, while in the North American release they're called Yoshi coins, they're definitely originally called Dragon coins. And, I mean, you could definitely make a case that dragons are just fire-breathing dinosaurs.
It's an interesting note. So, for me, I was always hurt because once upon a time I bought a Nintendo Power magazine. And it was an April Fool's edition, but I was naive, I didn't know better, and it told me I could evolve my Pokemon Dragonair into a Yoshi if I followed these steps. I never got my Yoshi, but it did state that Yoshi would have been a Dragon-type Pokemon. And to this day I'm an advocate of putting Yoshi in Pokemon games. But, to follow that up, if dragons are fire-breathing dinosaurs, should we start making dragons feathery?
Ooh, well, I mean, the difference between how many feathered dinosaurs actually were there?
All
That's
of
an
them or none
interesting
of them? It's
question.
hard to tell.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they definitely evolved, or a lot of them have definitely evolved into modern day birds.
Yeah. And with that, if you'd like to see your question featured as a crazy random question of the week, feel free to throw it in the comments. You can win a free copy, well, a free ebook copy of The Waltz of Blades. Thank you for tuning in.
And have a great day.
Take care and goodbye.